All right, are we about ready to get started? We're going to hear just a few words from the commissioner first before we start with the training, so I'll turn it over to him. Thanks for coming today. Thanks so much. Anything you want to follow up with? Good. That's great, Paul. That is the most important thing. There are snacks and drinks in the lobby. For those of you online, I'm sorry, but that's the best thing about being here in person. Feel free to get up, help yourself, take a stretch break if you need to, all good. All right, so we only get to do this if we are invited and sponsored, and that means that the county commission and the city came together and co-sponsored this and made it available for the public board. So I would like to say thank you to both the city and the county for making this available to your boards and allowing us to come in and share some information. Are we good to go online? Awesome. Okay. For those of you online, we have packets here in the room. Anybody in the room that didn't get a packet, they're sitting there in the middle. For those of you online, we will be going through these same packets, and there's a link that is available to you so you can see them and download them and print them if you would like as well. My name is Ashley Kent, and I am the Associate Director of the MSU Extension Local Government Center. We've been around since the mid-'80s, and our job is to provide training, technical assistance, and research to help build the capacity of local governments around the state. Now, there are 3 of us in our office, and we have that charge for all 56 counties, 127 incorporated municipalities, and the thousands of special districts. We spend a lot of time on the road doing trainings just like this. And this is really the piece that we like to do the best, because we get to have real conversations and hear what you're actually dealing with. So that's a little bit about me. For those of you in the room, I'm sorry, but I can pick on you, so I will. So I want to know which board you're serving on and just how long you've been in that role. So are you willing to share? Okay. Perfect. I love it. So Helena Citizens Council, awesome. How about you? Oh, okay, perfect. There's been lots of talk about that kind of stuff in Bozeman, so I'd love to hear more about what you guys got going on. That's great. How about you? The variance? Lucky you. How long you been doing that? September? Okay, right on. Well, thank you for joining the board. That's great. How about you, sir? Affordable housing. Okay. December. Cool. Right on. That's great. Well, I love that we have some new blood in the room, because that means that you guys are stepping up and serving your community, and this whole system only works if you're willing to do that. So thank you for that. We're going to go through, oh, I just got really big on the screen. We're going to go through the packet tonight, and this is a smaller crowd, so feel free to ask questions whenever. If anyone online has questions, please let me know anytime. Type them in the chat, and Danae will wave me down and make sure we get those answered. But before we dig into the material, I want to just do a quick kind of thought exercise and ground us in what we're working in. So why is it that we have local government? Why does it exist? And since there's only 4 of you, I'm just going to stare at all of you until somebody gives me something. Why do you think? Let's back up. Why do we live in communities? What's the benefit of living in a common geographical place versus spread out? There's convenience, right? And there are things that I might need and don't know how to do that you might be able to do, right? So we can share expertise back and forth. There's things that we can do better together than we can separately. Can you imagine if you were required to pave the road in front of your property where you live and 50 feet on either side? We're not going to supply you equipment, materials, expertise, just figure it out, make it happen. It's your responsibility. Can you imagine driving from here to Butte or here to Bozeman? It would be kind of awful, right? The value of our local services is that those kinds of shared services can be done better, more efficiently, and to higher quality if we come together, okay? How do we pay for those services? The T word, right? So we all voluntarily pool our resources through taxes, and we fund those local services through local dollars. Then how do we make sure that those services are being done and that whole system is being managed? Who does that? Who oversees the water and sewer systems? The city, and typically could be delegated to a water sewer district, right? But ultimate responsibility goes back to the city or the county. Same thing is true for almost all of our local services. They're local services funded by local dollars, and they're overseen by local people. That's different in our system than, say, expansionist England, where they would conquer a new territory, they'd come in, and they would appoint a governor from England to go to that territory and rule on behalf of the crown because we know better than you do. How would that work in Montana? Probably not, right? So we have this local service, local tax, and local control accountability that is then ensured by our fellow citizens, our people. Hello, come on in. Does that all make sense? So we're here to facilitate the public's process for their services. When you get elected or appointed to a board, it is now not your board. It is still the public's board. You're just there to facilitate. Okay. All right, let's talk about what happened in Montana in 1972. Any ideas? What happened in Helena in 1972? The Constitutional Convention. So did we have a constitution before 1972? Yes. 1889. How do you know it was in 1889? Yeah, so you have to have a constitution to get into the union. So we had a constitution drafted. We submitted it to the union because we wanted to be part of the cool kids club. They rejected us, said, no, that's not good enough. So we came back, hey, did you have a packet? Yeah, yeah, thanks. So we asked to be part of the union with our constitution. They said, nope. So we went back and drafted another one. We kind of stole pieces from other states that had recently been admitted because it worked for them, it should work for us, right? And we got accepted. So that's when we got accepted to the union and became the state of Montana. Who do you suppose that constitution from 1889 benefited most in the state? The mining barons, right? So it was not equal representation and equal benefit, this guiding document, this foundational document for us. It was heavily favoring the mining companies in Butte. And everybody knew that decisions happened in the back rooms of the bars in Butte, and then they would come up here to Helena and say, legislators, this is how you're gonna vote. That worked for a while, for better or worse. But then in the late 60s and early 70s, the state came together and said, this doesn't work for us anymore. We need something that adequately represents the needs of our people across the state. So we had the Constitutional Convention, the 100 delegates came together and created a new constitution for the state of Montana. Now, what does the Constitution, the federal Constitution, have that guarantees us the right to free speech and the right to protection from search and seizure? What is that? Yeah, amendments. And they are, the first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights, right? So we also have a Bill of Rights at the state level. So we have federal constitutional rights, and then we have state constitutional rights. The constitutional rights that are important for the work that we're going to talk about tonight, oh, I got really loud, are numbers 8, 9, and 10. It's the right to participate, the right to know, and the right to privacy. Those are the three that we are most concerned about when we talk about open meetings and local government. So we have Constitution, this is our governing document, inalienable rights, all of that. How do we go from that to our state law? Who makes the state law? They meet every other year. The legislature. Okay, so for 90 days, representatives come from all over the state, legislature, and debate and develop laws. And those that are successful are then codified into the Montana Code Annotated. That is the law book for the state of Montana. Okay. Now, do you think, are there things that you can do or maybe can't do in Lewis and Clark County that you could do in Powell County? Are there differences? Yeah. Who makes those laws? Who makes countywide laws? The same is true in the city. There are things that you can't do inside city limits, but things that those same things you could do as soon as you get outside city limits. Those are typically done through ordinance, which is local law, by the county commission and the city commission or council. So that's local policy. So one thing we hear a lot about is if a city has self-governing powers, which is a whole different discussion, they have the ability to restrict things like fireworks. Counties, most counties, I think there's only 3 that have not adopted self-governing powers. They operate under what we call general governing powers, and they're much more restricted. They do not have the ability to restrict fireworks. So every year on the 4th of July, I live in Belgrade right now, and every year on the 4th of July, people in Gallatin County get fired up because there's a drought and it's hazardous and it's all dry. You need to ban fireworks, you need to ban fireworks. And the city of Bozeman and the city of Belgrade will drastically restrict firework activity, but just outside of the city limits, you can set off as many as you want. And people get really angry about that. What we can't really explain very well is because the county doesn't have self-governing powers, they don't have the authority to restrict fireworks like the cities do. So it's a whole different thing, but that's one of those things where local policy can change based on which side of the line you're on, okay? And then what do you have that might govern your board differently than another board? What's that? City building codes? Oh yeah, yeah. And how do you know when you meet, how many board members you have, what your agenda should look like? Yeah, bylaws. Okay, so each of you has some section that you are responsible for, and you may need to know different parts of the code based on your responsibility of your board. Then your board itself, its internal operations are governed by bylaws or rules of procedure. So this is what we call a constitution to action. This is the big picture governing document that gives us all of our framework. And then as you move down each level from state and then city and county and then down into the boards, each one provides us a little bit more clarity. Now, believe it or not, this, the Montana Code, has lots of gray area in it. Those statutes are not super clear all the time. We prefer that to be the case because that means there's a lot of latitude for you to decide how you want those things enacted in your community. I would be willing to bet there are things that the city of Helena needs that might be different than the city of Havre or the town of West Yellowstone. And the value of the squishiness, the gray in the code, is that you have the flexibility within that framework to decide what works best for your local community, okay? Sometimes there are groups that say, we can do this under these statutes, and other groups that say, no, you can't. Who referees that? What's the third branch? The judiciary, yes. So in Montana, that would be up to including the Montana Supreme Court, or a lot of times we'll get an attorney general's opinion. And that can happen anywhere in here for clarification. So when we get one of those two, a case law, a ruling from the court system, or an attorney general opinion, it clarifies the code. It makes it less gray, but it also takes some of that flexibility away. So we want to find that balance of being clear enough that people can operate well, but not so overly clarified that you have no flexibility. Good? How are we doing with online questions? Good? Okay. This makes sense? Constitution to action. So we go through this first, so we have kind of that flow down. Then we can jump into some of the other material. Let me stick this over here. Okay, so if you want to open up your packets, they're on the left side. You should see page L1 is where we're going to start. Before we dig into these, let's just do a quick refresher about, just talk about one of them. The 3 branches of government. So at the federal level, what's the first branch? A branch. Executive branch. And who fills that role? The president. Okay. What else do we have? Legislative. And who does that? Congress, right? So the Senate and the House. And then that third branch we just talked about is judicial. I'm less concerned about judicial because that role is pretty clear through all levels of government. But let's take this down through the other levels. Who is the executive branch at the state level? The governor. And who's the legislative branch? Who makes the laws? The legislature, right? Representatives and senators. What about at the city level? If you have a mayor council form of government, who is the legislative branch? Who makes the laws? The council. The council is the governing body, okay? So you don't get to make laws as a single person in this country. You can clarify laws as the attorney general, but you don't get to make laws all by yourself, right? At least not without very special circumstances. By and large, it needs to be done through body. And at the city level, that's the council. So then the executive branch would be the mayor or the city manager, depending on how you're set up. Now, the tricky thing with this is then we look back at a commission form of government, which is what most of the county governments run as under Montana forms. Who's the legislative branch? Who makes the laws? The commission, right? But who's the executive branch? If you don't have a mayor and you don't have a single person, it's not a clear, oh, we have this other branch sitting out there. The commission actually acts as both the legislative and the executive branch, which can be tricky because that means that there are times when they're in legislative mode, in policy-making mode, they have to be in an open meeting setting. They can't do that behind closed doors. But all 3 of them, or 5 of them, or however many commissioners you have, typically 3, can be talking and meeting in private if they're in executive role, if they're executing policy, and not break open meeting laws. It's a very fine line to walk, but just kind of something to take note of. Now, most boards operate under legislative role only, which means you typically answer to the legislative branch, which would be the commission or the council. The important piece about this distinction is these guys create policy, these guys enact policy, which includes daily operations and oversight of staff. What I've seen happen is boards created under the legislative branch need help from city staff. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, I had this happen, and I had the board call me. They were upset because they said, we need help from the clerk. And we asked for her help, and she said, I'd love to help you, but I can't. The mayor has to direct me to do that. They said, we just need her help, and she won't do it. I said, actually, she's right, and she's protecting you. Because if this branch is responsible for directing employees, and this branch or its subsidiaries are trying to direct employees, you're outside of role and scope. Now, This side can request assistance from the staff and then send it to the mayor, or the manager, whoever it is. That person can then direct staff, and then they can help based on that direction. But they can't go outside of that relationship as city staff. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Now let's look at your packet. So on page L1, at the very top, you'll see those 3 rights that I talked about. These come right out of our Montana Constitution. The right to participation. The public has the right to expect governmental agencies to afford such reasonable opportunity for citizen participation in the operation of the agencies prior to the final decision as may be provided by law. So basically, we have a constitutional right in Montana to be a part of and have the ability to have public comment before any public body takes any action. That is a really high bar, and it's not the case. We have some of the strictest sunshine laws, that and the right to know, more so than almost any state in the union. So this is not the case in other states. We really value as a state the ability to be involved in these because, like we said before, these are our services and our tax dollars, so we need to be able to be involved in this process if we so choose. It's our right to decide whether we want to do that or not. So then the right to know. No person shall be deprived of the right to examine documents or to observe the deliberations of all public bodies or agencies of the state government and its subdivisions, except in cases in which the demand for individual privacy clearly exceeds the merits of public disclosure. So there are 2 times, and we'll talk about them later, 2 times that you can close a public meeting and stay inside the law. They're very, very limited and restricted times to do that. And the third piece of that is the right to privacy. The right to individual privacy is essential to the well-being of a free society and shall not be infringed without the showing of compelling state interest. If you violate someone's right to privacy, you better have a darn good reason to do so. Basically what that's saying. Because sometimes the right to know and the right to privacy, to uphold one, you have to break the other, and they have equal weight as constitutional rights. So you have to decide which right are you going to violate. We'll talk about that in a bit. Okay. Down at the bottom of the page, you see a big chunk that's all highlighted in yellow, 23103. For me, this is the most important piece of this entire packet, entire training, is this one statute. We spend a lot of time on it because if you understand the intent of this statute, you'll be good. Everything else is how you fulfill the intent in 103. Okay. Each agency shall develop procedures for permitting and encouraging the public to participate in agency decisions that are of significant interest to the public. So if you don't have bylaws or rules of procedure that define when you meet, how often you meet, where you post your agendas and notice your meetings, how you do that, how public can comment, what your agendas look like, all of that information, you are not likely in compliance with the first statement of that statute. We are required by law to meet that right to know and right to participate, to have these procedures defined, not just to admit or permit people to be involved, but to encourage public participation. That's the duty that's put on, the burden that's put on the boards. Now, you don't have a responsibility to make people show up, that's their right, but you have to protect them through your duty, okay? And then it has this little saying in here, we see it twice, the next sentence too, significant public interest. What is significant public interest? We talked about the gray in the code. This is one of those things. Any thoughts? How do you know when it's significant? So there's some clarification in case law about this. And really what it came down to is if you're expending any public funds, that's significant. If you're doing anything with land, that's significant. If you're restricting any kind of behavior or in any way, that's significant. So really, what they decided is that anything more than a ministerial act, which is an act where you have no discretion, you're just enacting something that's already been decided. Anything more than that is significant public interest, needs to be on an agenda, noticed, and the public needs to be able to comment on it before final action is taken, which in most cases is a vote. Okay. The next sentence says the procedures must ensure adequate notice and assist public participation before a final agency action is taken, again, that is of significant interest to the public. Must ensure adequate notice. What does that mean? How long is adequate notice? Yeah. It depends. It's like the best lawyer answer ever, right? So this is one of those things that had to go to the third branch of government. And they said, we need some clarification. Some people said it was 12 hours is good. Some people said we need 72 hours. So the AG came out with opinion and said, the minimum amount of time is 48 hours. You have to post at least 48 hours before the meeting, the notice and the agenda, okay? That time should increase relative to the importance of the topic being considered. So if the City of Helena is considering disincorporation, probably going to need more than 48 hours, right? Most decisions that are big enough that you're going to need extended time don't happen in a single meeting. You're going to have a series of meetings where you talk about this. It's going to move through each of those meetings with new information. And at the last meeting, then you get to a point where you're ready to take final action. But we might introduce it in September, have information and discussion and updates through October, November, December, January, and finally make a decision in February. That's pretty common. Each one of those meetings then needs to be noticed 48 hours ahead of when the meeting happens. Okay? So once those things are clarified by either case law or the Attorney General opinion, they hold the same weight as law because they are clarifying what the law says, unless up until the point where they may be overturned. All right. So tell me, what does your agenda look like for your meetings, just kind of in general? Typically, you have some kind of opening ceremonies where we might do roll call, pledge of allegiance, introduce special visitors, things like that. Opening ceremonies. And then what do you do? Yeah. Old business, okay. When do you do minutes? When do you approve previous minutes? Did you do it before old business? Sometimes, okay. Let's say that we do minutes and reports here, and then we do old business. Some kind. Okay, then we do old business. Does anybody here use a consent agenda? Okay, that's probably good. So consent agendas are really helpful if you have a lot of information that you're trying to get through, and works well for commissions or for the city council in certain instances, but they can also be really dangerous because they can open you up to lawsuits unnecessarily. So a consent agenda is where you take a bunch of routine information. In this case, it might be the minutes, the reports, stuff that's non-controversial, and you approve it as a single block. So you'd say, I move to approve the consent agenda, which would be everything in this section. You could then, before you do that, let's say I want to pull out the finance report because I have a question on it. I could say, I move to pull the finance report from the consent agenda. We would move it down between the consent and old business, and then we would approve the rest of the consent agenda in one motion. So it's handy if you've got a ton of information to get through and it's pretty non-controversial. But like I said, it can be dangerous because where do you do public comment on your agendas? I don't know then. Okay, so you had some here. Okay, so there's not a single right way to do public comment. You just need to allow it before final action is taken. So some groups do it right here before anything else happens. As soon as we do the call to order, you do public comment. Sometimes it's public comment for things only on the agenda. Sometimes it's public comment for anything on the agenda or not under the agenda, but under the jurisdiction. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Sometimes it's all right here. Some groups say anything on the agenda here, and do public comment with each item under old business, each item under new business, and then do a one at the end for things not on the agenda. There's lots of ways you can slice and dice this. It's not a thing to overdo the opportunity for public comment. So you're not going to do it too much. And if there's none, that's great, you move on. But the reason I bring this up is because there was a city, and we like to not name names, but it was Great Falls. And if you mess up bad enough, not only do you pay damages, but we also use you in our stories. So Great Falls did that. They had a consent agenda. And in their routine business, they didn't think anybody was going to have kind of heartburn over it. They had a vendor who was providing services for like a dog pound, basically. They would go out and catch the dogs, run around and put them in the Humane Society and all that stuff, and host the Humane Society. And they were moving from one vendor to the other. And there was about a 6-week gap between the two contracts. So in their consent agenda, they had something along the lines of approve the extension of the original contract by 6 weeks. So we have continuation of service up through the date that anyone starts. They did that. Yep, go ahead and approve the whole consent agenda. And then they had public comment right here, first time in the meeting. And a gal got up and she was angry about this. And I don't remember which side she was on, why it was an issue, but she was really, really upset. And Great Falls has a policy of 3 minutes per person for public comment, which is not a problem as long as it's in policy and it's enforced consistently. She got up, did her 3 minutes, and then went way over and kept getting more and more angry, more agitated, more upset. Ma'am, thank you for your comment. Your 3 minutes are up. Ma'am, we need you to calm down. Ma'am, please stop talking. Your 3 minutes are up. She just kept getting more and more angry. So finally, they had to have a police officer come in and escort her out of the room. So he came up to the lectern and he grabbed all of her materials, kind of gathered them up, kind of took her by the arm and started escorting her out the back of the room. And they got back to the doorway into the hall and she kneed him in the groin and took off running. So he's there laying on the floor trying to catch his breath. Finally, they catch up to her and they charge her with disorderly conduct, assaulting a police officer, and evading arrest. All of this from public comment, right? So she gets an attorney, and the attorney says, tell me what happened. And she said, well, they had this meeting and they made this decision. And then I got up to talk and they wouldn't listen to me. She said, wait. They made the decision before you had a chance to comment? She said, yeah. And she said, great, we're gonna countersue. And they did. And the judge found that because they didn't follow the proper process and violated her constitutional right to participate, because she didn't get to talk before the final decision, they found in favor of the countersuit. How much do you think it costs to violate a constitutional right in Montana? Just wild guess. 10,000. Anybody else? $500,000. It costs $500,000 if you violate a constitutional right. You get taken to court and you lose. Do you think the court cares about whether you, as a public board member, know what the law says about public comment? No. And do you think the court cares about what size your jurisdiction is? No. So City Council in Great Falls got to go tell their entire citizen group that they had to raise or levy a new assessment, not because they were getting new services, but because the council messed up and now they had to pay this lawsuit. That's bad enough amongst that many people. Can you imagine it amongst a district of 300 people? That's why this is so important. It seems like it's just an administrative thing, but it's absolutely valuable to protecting those rights. Okay? How are we online? Oh, okay. Ooh, let's try it. Okay. Yeah. I'm getting no Nancy. Nancy, if you are able to unmute, do you want to unmute yourself and we'll try an audio question? Nothing. Okay. Yeah, that's great. So the question we had earlier today was, how do we know where we're supposed to post? Is it in the newspaper? Can we do it online? Is it at the city hall? Where's the appropriate place to post to be in compliance with this adequate notice? And I think that's a great question. It's found in statute 7-1-2121. So Title II of the code governs, it's governance and administration. Government and administration. And then Title VII is specifically about local government. So this statute comes out of the local government title. And it says, basically, if you have a newspaper that has sufficient publication, weekly publication, it needs to be in there. If you don't, then you have to have 3 places around the county, that, and this is in a county statute, 3 places around the county that have to be designated in your resolution, that people know they can go look there because it's always posted in the same places. If you don't know which one is which, make sure you talk to either your commissioner council, whichever one you fall under, city or county, or your city or county attorney. They can tell you what appropriate posting is. We've also had people ask about if we can post the notice that we're going to have a meeting and when it's going to be in the newspaper or online, and then point them to where the agenda is if they want to see the full agenda. And my response is always, we are not attorneys at the center, so I will defer to your city or county legal counsel. But we generally feel that if you have notice in the newspaper and they have a place to go and it's consistent, you can have that agenda posted, say, you can put it online, but you also need to make sure it's somewhere accessible that's not online, because we can't assume that everyone has access to the internet. So it may be that you post the agenda at the courthouse, the library, and the post office. It saves on that budget because a quarter page or a half page ad for an agenda could get really expensive. But just make sure you are clear with your legal counsel, because they're the ones that defend it, what is appropriate notice for your board. Good? Oh, yeah. Okay, so the question there is, can we post the notice on the online version of the IR and then point them to our Facebook page where we have the agenda? And that Facebook link is in the IR notice. That's fine as long as you also have it in the print version, because you can't assume that people have access to the online version of the paper or to Facebook. It can be a place you post it, but it's not one of the required places. We have to assume the kind of the lowest common denominator for accessibility. So you can do that above and beyond, but make sure that you also have it somewhere physical. Make sense? Okay. Good? Good, okay. All right, so we are like halfway through this one statute. So the agenda for the meeting, as defined in 23202, which we'll look at, must include an item allowing public comment on any public matter that is not on the agenda of the meeting and that is within the jurisdiction of the agency conducting the meeting. So it's basically saying you have to have somewhere on your agenda the ability for the public to comment on something that isn't on the agenda, but is something that they could potentially have a decision on, some jurisdiction over. A lot of times what we'll see is that will happen at the very end of the meeting. How is that okay if we have to have public comment before final action? Not on agenda under jurisdiction. The second part of that says the agency may not take action on any matter discussed unless specific notice of that matter is included on the agenda and public comment has been allowed on the matter. So if they want to talk about something that's not on the agenda, you have to have a place on the agenda for them to do that. You cannot take any action on it other than, thanks for your comment, that's important, we'll put it on the next agenda if you decide to do that. But you can't take any action because, let's say we're a fire board, fire district, and somebody brought up something about, that's not on the agenda about fire suppression. And you say, yep, that's a good idea, let's do that. If you decide that that night, then everybody who didn't go to the meeting because they didn't know that that conversation was going to happen, didn't have an opportunity to comment before that decision was made. So you're violating the constitutional right of everybody that wasn't there because they didn't know it was going to happen. That makes sense? So it's a place for people to comment or have thoughts about anything under that board's jurisdiction with no expectation that they're going to take action right then and there. Okay. The other thing about adequate notice. So we know we need to post the notice that the meeting is happening, and we need to post the agenda so people can see what we're talking about. If we are a fire district, is that adequate notice? What do you think? No. Fire truck on the agenda under new business is not adequate notice because what are we doing with the fire truck? Are we painting it? Are we buying a new one? Are we going to ride in it because the boys won the state basketball tournament? What are we doing? Right? So you have to have enough description on your agenda that people can understand the essence of what's being considered. So we might say, consider purchase of 2008 pumper truck for $84,000. That, I would argue, is a much more defendable agenda for notice because as a citizen, I know what that board is considering. Now, do I have to be a part of that district to be able to go to the meeting and give public comment? No. It doesn't say members of the district is a constitutional right. It says citizens and the public. So whether I receive those services or not, I have the right to go observe and participate in those public deliberations. That can get a little bit confusing sometimes. Let's say that hypothetically, you had a issue come up and it got talked about on social media and people got angry and they misunderstood what was going to happen and they show up to the meeting and they're fired up, ready to take on the battle. Not that it would happen in Lewis and Clark County, but somewhere it might. How do you deal with that kind of high intensity situation in a public meeting? Any thoughts? Yeah. Ooh. So you can limit the time of public comment as long as it's consistent and you have it in your policy, your bylaws somewhere, rules of procedure. A lot of times we'll see 3 minutes. You have 3 minutes for public discussion or public comment. And that means I could have 3 minutes here, I could have 3 minutes here on each of those topics, right? Because I have the right to speak on any item before final decision is made. So each of those different items. What I've seen some groups do is public comment on anything on the agenda here. But if you're here because you want to talk about this, hold your comment till we get to that section for that specific thing. If anybody that wants to talk about anything else on the agenda, do it here. We want to make sure that we have these comments fresh when we have this discussion. Now we know they're angry. We know they're going to be fired up. So what we suggest is you have this process set up. You explain how the process is going to go. So everybody knows when they're going to be able to participate. And you use this structure to keep everybody kind of calm. So you have this considered purchase of a 2008 pumper truck for $84,000. And let's say the fire chief is the one saying that we need this. So we're going to introduce the topic and say, hey, we're going to have the fire chief give an expert presentation. Going to make the case for why we need this, why this is a good deal, and what value it's going to bring to the district. and you give the fire chief 15, 20 minutes to go through and make his case. And then you have a Q&A time with the board. So just the board gets to talk to the expert witness, the fire chief in this case, okay? They can ask questions of him or her. If you're savvy about what people are upset about, this is a great time for the board to ask questions that you know the citizens are going to ask as well, but not as calmly. So if you have the board members asking those questions, two things happen. The citizens get their answers or their questions clarified while they're still able to listen before they can react to it. And they start to build some rapport and trust with the board members who are asking the questions, because if this person has the same question that I do, it shows me that they're not just rubber stamping this, they're actually putting some critical thought into it. So it's a great time to build some trust and to keep people kind of calm while you clear up some information. Then once you've done that, then you open up public comment. So you open it up, let everybody talk that wants to talk. When they come up to the stand, who do they address? Are they talking to the fire chief? They shouldn't be. Public comment is addressed to the board, specifically to the chairperson of the board. Okay, Madam Chair, members of the board, here are my thoughts. The board can then direct those questions back to the fire chief if they want. But this is not a free-for-all open time to attack fire chief. Right? So you have public comment, give everybody a chance to talk. It's standard practice, best practice to ask for public comment 3 times. Is there any public comment? Everybody comes up and does their thing. Is there any additional public comment on this topic? You might get 1 or 2. Third and final call, public comment on this topic. I would do that every time on every agenda topic that you have in every meeting. It sounds redundant, but there is no question that you are providing ample opportunity for people to comment. Okay. So once everybody gets done, they've had their say, then you close public comment and you go back to more board discussion. They just heard all of this information from the expert witness and from the public. Now, public have those conversations, and then you take final action. Action could be to purchase the truck, to not purchase the truck, to table until the next meeting because we need more information. All of those things are action, but you need to have these happen first. Good? What if a board member, let's say you have 6 members on the board, and one of them can't be there that night, but really don't think this is a good idea, and the citizens are angry about it anyway. Will you just vote no for me at the meeting by proxy? Can you do that? Not in Montana, not in public meetings. Why could you not vote by proxy? Why can I not just say vote no for me? If I made my decision before I got to the meeting, do you feel like your public comment had any weight? No, right? So there's no way that you can say, I made my decision before we got here, but this meant something. That's not how this works. So there's no proxy voting for public boards in the state. Nonprofit boards are a totally different story, but for publicly funded or appointed boards, you can't do that. Good. Okay, how are we doing online? Ooh, let me finish this one and we'll go to the e-meeting thing, because that'll fit well with 202 and 203. So the last bit of this first statute is talked about things not on the agenda. Public comment received at a meeting must be incorporated into the official minutes of the meeting. So that's part of the record of the meeting, okay? Now, if you have set time limits and people push back and say that doesn't give me enough time to make my point, I can't get my thoughts out adequately, you're restricting my right to participate. You can say, well, we have 3 minutes of verbal comment, but you are also welcome to submit written comment. So if you want to submit written comment instead, you can fully kind of explore those thoughts, share them with the board, and then they take that under consideration with equal weight to verbal comment. So that's an option if you have so much to say that you can't do it in 3 minutes. And 3 minutes is tight. All right, let's look at L3, talk about open meetings. So 23201 open meeting says, the legislature finds and declares that public boards, commissions, councils, and other public agencies in this state exist to aid in the conduct of the people's business. It is the intent of this part that actions and deliberations of all public agencies shall be conducted openly. The people of the state do not wish to abdicate their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. Toward these ends, the provisions of this part shall be liberally construed. We are not giving up our rights as citizens with our tax dollars and our services to participate in this process just because we elected somebody to the board or appointed them. So this is saying open meetings are there to protect the rights of the citizens. 23202 is an important one. Don't need that. So what do we know we have to have at a meeting? What's the first thing you need? A quorum, okay? So you have to have 50% plus one of your filled positions. Now, if you have a vacancy, it doesn't count against you, meaning you don't have to meet necessarily the same bar because it would be a higher bar to get to 50% plus one if you have a seat that's vacant. Now, that's different than if somebody's absent, but vacant seat doesn't count against you. So 50% plus one. So if you have 6 members of a board, you need 4 to make quorum, right? Let's say 2 of those seats are vacant for 2 weeks. So if that's the case, then you are only required to make the 50% plus 1 of the 4 remaining filled seats. So to get to quorum with 4 members, you would only need 3. Make sense? Okay, so we have to have quorum. What else do we know we need? We just talked about this. How do we know when we're going to meet? The agenda. And what do you do with the agenda? You notice it, right? At 48 hours or more. And on the agenda, you have to have what? Regardless of the topics, who gets to talk? Public, right? So you have to have public comment. And then what's the record of the meeting? Minutes. Every open meeting has to have minutes. There are 6 elements to a legal meeting in Montana. These are the first 5. The last one can be found in 23202. It says, a meeting means the convening of a quorum of the constituent membership of a public agency or association, whether corporeal or by means of electronic meeting, which means whether you are in the room or you're doing it via email, via phone, text, WebEx, whatever it is, Zoom, those all count in creating a quorum, whether that's helpful for you or not. So whether by corporeal or electronic means, which we'll come back to, to hear, discuss, or act upon a matter over which the agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. So that last bit. This is a really important conjunction. Because let's say that you have 3 commissioners and 2 of them go to the Saints basketball game and they're sitting together. Do we automatically have a meeting? Not necessarily, because we have a quorum, 2 out of the 3, but we don't know what they're hearing, discussing, or acting. Now, if they're sitting together and somebody comes up to them and says, hey, commissioner, I know I have this thing on the agenda next week that we're going to talk about, and I really want to know where you stand on it and what you think my chances are of getting it approved. They just heard something that they have jurisdiction over, right? Whether they take action or not doesn't matter because it's an or. So if any one of these 3 things happen in conjunction with a quorum, you have a meeting. These 2 make it a meeting. These 4 make it legal. Okay. So if you have 3 of your 6 fire board members present, what can you do? Nothing. A lot of times we'll have people say, well, we can discuss about the agenda, but we can't take any action. You can't. To have a legal meeting, you have to have a quorum to be able to discuss. Okay? All right, so let's go back and talk about this corporeal or electronic equipment thing. This is good and bad because now that we have the advent of Zoom, we can have 4 of the board members in the room and 2 of them on Zoom, and we have a 6-person board all present, which is great. It gives us the opportunity for people to participate that wouldn't have been able to in the past because they live too far out of town or whatever the issue is. So in that sense, this is really helpful. The drawback to it is every time that a board member sends an email to the rest of the board, you have a potential for a public meeting. And that public meeting wasn't noticed, there's no agenda, and there's no place for public comment, so it's not legal. This is, again, goes back to things of significant public interest, anything more than a ministerial act. If you're having substantive discussions about something that you have jurisdiction over via email, via text, on the phone, with a quorum, you are in violation of the open meeting laws. We had a question on this earlier. What was it? Yeah, that's right. Okay. So the question was, if you are having a discussion via email with the board, but it's about something that's not under your jurisdiction, that's there at the end of 23202, is it still a violation of open meetings? My first question is, why are you talking about it as a board? If it has nothing to do with you, why are you having that conversation? Second, everything you write down has the potential to be a public record. Keep that in mind. And third, if you're talking about it because it could in any way be construed that it has anything to do, even tangentially, with a decision that you might make, you could be violating open meetings. So I would very much recommend you stay away from that. Don't have discussions on email. And this happens all over the state. It's not because people are trying to cause havoc or they're trying to subvert the laws. They just don't know. It's just we get into this natural habit of emailing, and that's what we do. What happens when you do that is you exclude the public from their right back to right to know. They have a constitutional right to observe deliberations. That conversation is a deliberation, and now excluding them from it is violating that right. Okay. We have what we call ex parte communication, especially in the quasi-judicial role. If you are talking about zoning or variances or adherence to policy, things like that, where you're making a quasi-judicial decision, ex parte is really important. You can't have conversations with other board members, with interested parties, with anybody outside of a public meeting, because it's basically a pseudo law or courtroom. On the legislative side, if you're just on a board and you're doing the legislative policy piece, you have more leniency. You should be talking to your constituents, finding out what's going on with them and that kind of thing. But let's say we have a 6-person board and the 3 of us are having a conversation about something on the agenda. Have we violated the open meeting law? Not necessarily, because quorum would be 4, right? So the 3 of us having a conversation, probably not great practice, but it's not in violation. Now, if the 3 of us have that conversation and then I go talk to the 4th board member about the conversation we just had, now we do have a violation, because 4 of the 6 board members have substantive information that the public was not aware of. So that's kind of like a chain reaction. You can't do that because that is not acting consistent with that 23103 and with our constitutional right to know. This makes things a lot harder when you can't just kind of email back and forth. What are your thoughts? What do you think? We recommend that if you're sending out, say, board packets and things like that, you have a designated person that does it, whether that's a staff liaison or somebody on the board, and BCC everybody so they can't accidentally reply all and have a conversation on accident in that electronic forum. If you do happen to have some kind of ex parte or improper communication outside of an open meeting that needs to be in the open meeting, you disclose it at the next open meeting. Hey, this conversation happened on accident. We didn't mean to not allow the public into it. So here's the substance of the conversation that was had, and let them in on that kind of information. That's the transparent way to remedy the situation while you maintain trust with the public. Good? Yeah. Ooh. Yes. So if I have a Google Doc on my Fireboard and I have shared it with everybody else on the board, we have access and we go in there and we edit that document and the public can't get to it, that's not good. Because anytime anybody's in there sharing information and everybody else has access, you're back to this hear and discuss thing. And it's not meeting the transparency requirements of the right to know and participate. Again, I understand that that is difficult because it's sometimes the most efficient way to do things, but government is not about being efficient, it's about being fair. And the business is people and people's rights. And if we have to decide between efficiency and constitutional rights, we pick constitutional rights every single time. One, because it's the right thing to do. Two, because it costs a lot of money to violate those rights. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. So would it be different if the public could see it, if they had free access to get into the document, something like that? Potentially, yes. The problem is, again, you can't assume everybody has access to the internet. So it needs to be a document that is available to everybody regardless of their technological resources. And then every time it would be updated, it would need to be done in the public sphere. The other thing that we think is kind of good practice and an important thing to do is make sure that your board has, if you have email addresses, have an email address specifically for each board seat that's separate from your personal email address. And we would prefer to have it be board member Ward 1 at Fire District versus Jane Smith at Fire District. Because then when that seat turns over, that board seat with a new member, they can just hand over the email address. It's consistent for the public, and then that new member has the entire history of what that communication record is. The other big piece of that is everything you do as a public board member is subject to a Freedom of Information Act request or a subpoena in a court case. And let's say you're using your public email address or your private email address for public work, you get subpoenaed. Now the court has the right to look through all of your personal emails. If it's on the board member email address, you turn over the board member email to them and your private stuff is protected, at least to some degree. I was doing this a couple weeks ago and I had a gal ask, I've been doing this for 8 or 10 years. I've always done it in my personal email address. Is it too late? Should I just not even bother because I'm already kind of in a tight spot? And I said, no, I still think it's important to do it because anything you've done to this point could potentially be called through your private email address. But if you start now and work forward with that separate address, anything you do from here forward, you can prove was done through that board member email and protect your own. So what's already happened has already happened, but moving forward, you can provide more protection. Good? Okay. Real quick, we're on the quorum subject. This also came up a couple weeks ago when I was doing a round of these. And it's happened a couple times in the last month or so that people have had this question. Say we had the fire board and we had 6 people on the fire board and we had to have a subcommittee for something. And they said, well, I had one person say, well, we have 6 people on the committee or on the board, so we appointed 2 to this subcommittee so we don't have quorum requirements because that's not a quorum of the board. And we appointed 3 citizens to fill out the rest of the subcommittee, excuse me. And so we have 2 board members and 3 citizens. So we don't have to worry about open meeting laws. That is not true. So if we look at the next section, 23203, all meetings of public or governmental bodies must be open to the public. if they are supported in whole or in part by public funds or are expending public funds. So that's 23203 subsection 1. And then subsection 6 says any committee or subcommittee appointed by a public body or an association described in subsection 2 for the purpose of conducting business that is within the jurisdiction of that agency is subject to the requirements of this section. So if you are funded in whole or in part by public funds, if you expend public funds in any way, or if you are created by a public body, and that includes a subcommittee of a board, that new subcommittee now has to follow open meeting laws just like the board does. So just because you put 2 of your 6 members on the committee doesn't mean that you get out of the open meeting laws. The new committee of 2 board members and 3 citizens, that committee of 5, now has its own standards for quorum, for public meetings, for notice, minutes, all of it. Does that make sense? It seems to be something that's been coming up, so I just want to make sure that we're keying in on that so we don't have that confusion going on. All right. Also in 23203, this is where we get to the 2 times that you can close a meeting. Subsection 3. The presiding officer, wait, let's stop. Did we get all those pieces? Okay. Presiding officer of any meeting may close the meeting during the time the discussion relates to a matter of individual privacy, and then if and only if the presiding officer determines that the demands for individual privacy clearly exceed the merits of public disclosure. The right of individual privacy may be waived by the individual about whom the discussion pertains, and in that event, the meeting must be open. So one of the 2 times you can close a meeting. If you are discussing personal information that a reasonable person would not want provided to the entire general public. And there's a case law on this, and they came back to say that would include things like medical records and IQ records, arrest records, performance evaluations, all of those things. So if a reasonable person would not want that information shared with the public, that person has the right to have a closed session or an executive session meeting. If that person waives their right, the board doesn't get to decide on their behalf that we're going to close it anyway. It's the person's right to waive or not the board's. This happens a lot with school boards. In fact, it just happened in Red Lodge here a few weeks ago. The board was reviewing a performance evaluation and deciding whether or not to terminate the contract of a teacher. He's a teacher. That could have been a private closed session because it's his right to personal information, his performance evaluation. And he decided to waive that right. So that meeting had to be open. And then they packed the gym with all of his supporters. And that school board had to have that discussion in front of a fairly hostile crowd to them. So it's sometimes to the advantage of the person being discussed to waive their right. But once they waive that right, that's it. It's not the board's decision to go back. What? Every time I do workshops, my entire family calls me at some point in the 2 hours. Okay, so that's one time. The other time that you can close a meeting legally is subsection 4. Except as provided in subsection 4B, a meeting may be closed to discuss the strategy to be followed with respect to litigation when an open meeting would have a detrimental effect on the litigating position of the public agency. Then B has a caveat that if it's a public entity that's litigating against another public entity, there is no expectation for privacy. So if the county is suing the state, it doesn't get to be a closed meeting, even if it's for litigation strategy. It has to be the body being sued by a private party. Okay, so personnel issues or information and litigation strategy against a private party. Those are the 2 times that you can close a public meeting in Montana legally. The issue with closing a meeting, back to our constitutional rights, the right to know and participate, and the right, especially the right to know, and the right to privacy, individual privacy. Those are both constitutional rights, which means they hold equal weight. And in this case, to uphold one, you have to violate the other. If I want my right to privacy protected, we have to violate the public's right to know, and vice versa. I would highly recommend you never close a meeting unless legal counsel knows about it and concurs, because they're the ones that would have to defend you. If you do have to decide between the 2 constitutional rights and you don't have access to legal counsel for whatever reason, Err on the side of privacy, because if the court comes back and decides that it should have been public, you can release the minutes of the meeting. If you err on the side of right to know and it's a public meeting and the court comes back and says, no, that should have been right to privacy as superseding, you can't unring the bell. You can't bring that information back and take it out of people's minds, right? So if you're gonna have to decide on the one that the corrective action would not do any harm. Make sense? Okay. All right, so that got us all the way through public meetings and closed meetings. So each open meeting has to have minutes. Those minutes in 23212 must include the date, time, and place of the meeting, the list of the board members or body members in attendance, and substance of all matters proposed, discussed, or decided. Whoever does your minutes deserves some kind of treat because they are hard to do. Finding that balance between enough information that you get the substance of the conversation, but not too much, it's a really fine line. The goal is if somebody were to pick up those minutes and have no idea what this board does, who any of the people are, they could pick it up, read it, and understand what happened at that meeting. Okay? If for some reason on the back on L4, you have to do a closed session, those meeting minutes are kept separate from the public portion of the meeting. To be approved, you would go to the next meeting, don't put them in an electronic package, you can't control that. They would go hard copy to the board members. They would review the minutes right before the meeting. Then when we get into the agenda, you would have to have notice that there's reviewing public or private closed session minutes potential for another closed session, because if they need to correct something in those minutes, they have to go back into closed session to correct them. And now that's a new closed session. There needs to be new closed session minutes for, and they're going to have to be approved at the next open meeting. And this just goes on and on and on, right? If there's not corrections that need to be made, then those minutes are sealed in a manila envelope. And the back, you have the board members sign and date it, and then it's stored somewhere separate from where your normal minutes are kept. So typically they're kept in either the commission's office, the clerk and recorder's office, the clerk's office at the city, somewhere. The closed meeting minutes are often kept with the attorney in the attorney's office under lock and key. And they can only be viewed by court order after that. So just to keep in mind. All right. So are you feeling good? Open meetings, minutes, public participation, all that good stuff? Good. Okay. We have some example of minutes and open meeting law narrative in here. And then let's jump back to the code of ethics. So the code of ethics is on, well, let's look at L10 on the left side packet. 2-2-103. The holding of public office or employment is a public trust created by the confidence that the electorate reposes in the integrity of public officers, legislators, or public employees. That person shall carry out the individual's duties for the benefit of the people of the state. The person departs from the public duty, he or she is liable to the people of the state and is subject to the penalties provided in this part for abuse of the public's trust. This is important because if you violate the Montana code of ethics, you can be held personally liable, which includes up to a fine and jail time. You want to make sure that you don't end up there, right? It's fairly easy not to do that for the most part, as long as you know what your sideboards are. So if you look at 2-2-104 at the bottom of that page, public officer, legislator, or employee may not disclose or use confidential information acquired in the course of official duties in order to further substantially that individual's personal economic interests. So let's say you are on the planning board and you find out that, well, there's a piece of property outside of town that's zoned ag right now and it's not really worth much and it doesn't have any improvements and it's not great ag land anyway. So it's just sitting out there and it's really cheap. And you, as part of your planning board role, find out that Amazon is looking to buy the parcel directly next to it. Can you then go put a bid in on that piece of property out there that's super cheap? No. So this is where we talk about big E and little e ethics. Big E ethics, violation of the letter of the law. That is improper use of information that you obtain by virtue of your position as a public board member. What if then that Amazon bid is put into the board packet and it's posted online at 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, like every Thursday, like you do your board packets. And then you go put in your bid on that adjacent property at 3:04. Is that legal? This is where we talk about little e ethics. Technically, the information is public, but practically, there's no expectation that people are going to be able to see that, digest it, understand what it means, and go put a competing bid on in a reasonable amount of time. So it may not be a violation of the letter of the law, but it is a violation of the intent, and it's not a good look. Okay. 2, you cannot accept a gift of substantial value or a substantial economic benefit tantamount to a gift. Substantial value, if you flip back to this page before, is defined as a value of $50 or more for an individual. So if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, you do a great job serving on the water sewer district, I want to buy you a coffee. Can you accept that? Yeah, that's totally fine. What if you're going to go to Howard Townsend and you've got a big project you're working on, you buy a bunch of lumber, because that's like gold, apparently, and they're going to give you a 25% discount because you're on the water sewer board. Can you do that? Depends on how much it is, right? But probably not. You shouldn't. So that goes back to that benefit tantamount to a gift. It's not economic value per se, but it is giving you a benefit that you wouldn't have otherwise. Yeah. That is a great question. What if somebody's gifting you multiple copies? So, perfect example. City of Bozeman Commission was receiving, each commissioner was receiving 2 movie tickets from the local theater once a month. So this was like 10 years ago. So the tickets were $6 or $7 a piece, but each month they were getting this, say, $14 in value. Does that count? This isn't super clear about whether it's one time or it's cumulative. This is, so you can't accept a gift of substantial value that would tend to improperly influence a reasonable person in the person's position to depart from the faithful or impartial discharge of the person's public duties. So just getting a coffee, right? Let's say you got 4 coffees, because coffees are expensive. In and of itself may not seem bad. In the case of the city commissioners in Bozeman, they said, we really appreciate what you're trying to do, but we can't accept this because we don't ever want there to be a potential appearance of impropriety, right? So they said, thanks, but no thanks. About 2 years later, that same movie theater was sold and it came up for rezoning. So if the commissioners had been receiving these 2 monthly tickets for date night as a thank you for their service in the city for 2 years, and then this request for rezoning comes up, what's the expectation by the public that this is going to be a fair decision? That gets a little bit dicey, right? So that gets down to if you are not clear, ask for advice from your city or county attorney. They're the ones that have to defend it. But I would err on the side of staying under $50 total. Now, if you go to a conference in your official role, let's say you're in the water sewer district and you go to the Montana Rural Water Conference, and at the vendor fair, they have a raffle for a $75 Amazon gift card, and you put your business card in and you get picked. Is that in violation? Not necessarily, because it's at a professional conference. It was a random drawing, and there's no expectation that it would improperly influence your duties. It's just a drawing at a conference, okay? City of Bozeman, in reaction to wanting to be very, very careful that they're not violating code of ethics, they have their own city charter, which is like a local constitution. They get to decide a lot of things that they want to do. One is that they have their own code of ethics. You can't give yourself permission to break the law. So they can't say, well, our substantial value is $75 instead of $50. You can't go less lenient than the state law. You can make it more restrictive than the state law. So the city of Bozeman said, we're going to make it so nobody can accept any gift of any value that works for the city as an employee or an elected official. Okay. And then a couple years, I think it was a couple years after that was enacted. Do you remember when downtown Bozeman, the R-Bar blew up in 2009? There was about a half a block on Main Street in Bozeman that in the first part of May at 8:05 it was there, and at 8:17 it was not. It was just gone. And one lady lost her life in that, but it could have been a heck of a lot worse. And the emergency response that we saw in town from the fire, paramedics, police, everybody was absolutely amazing. They did an incredible job of protecting people the best that they could. And for the next year, there was nowhere that those guys and gals could go in town and buy a meal. Everybody wanted to buy them dinner. They weren't allowed to accept that based on that policy. You can't accept any gift. So do you reject the public's generosity in trying to support your local emergency response, or do you violate your employer's policy? They had little kids coming in. A 6-year-old came in with a tray of cupcakes and said, "Mr. Fireman, thank you so much for protecting us." Who's going to turn down the 6-year-old's cupcakes? So what they did, they had a little lobby area and they put a folding table out and they put the cupcakes on the table, and then they put a note on it that said cupcakes for public consumption. And then the firefighters ate all of them, but they were at least available to the public, right? They started to realize that, good intentioned as it was, their ethics policy was creating friction in their public engagement. So they have since backed off of that and have a less restrictive gift policy. Okay. So you can't accept gifts. You can't use information that you get through your position. Yeah. Yep. No, because, so the question was, when you had the North Hills fire, they were soliciting donations of food and drink to give some reprieve to the firefighters. Was that illegal? So if we flip back to page L9, where we have it highlighted in 22102 subsection 3, gift of substantial value would be over $50 or more. Things that don't count towards that are things that get used or donated within 30 days that don't benefit the person, or food and beverage consumed on the occasion when the participant is in a charitable, civic, or community event, award publicly presented for recognition of service, educational activity, clearly serving the public good. So those are the times when you have exception. The difference, I would say, between that situation and what happened in Bozeman is, in Bozeman it was happening after the fact as a thank you. There was no urgent public need. When those guys and gals were up risking their lives trying to protect structures and people, it's happening right now. And we're going to have the community come together and rally. That is absolutely okay. There's also some ways to find some more flexibility. If you have a Friends of the Fire Department nonprofit, they can do a lot of things with fundraising and expending funds that a public body can't. We see that a lot with library boards. They'll have the library and then they'll have a foundation. And the foundation can hold fundraisers, they can buy things, they can do all these things that the public library itself can't. But the foundation as a nonprofit has a lot more leniency. So there's lots of ways to kind of slice and dice that, but it all is really dependent on the facts of the situation. Yeah. Okay. So if I'm buying coffee because it's my friend's birthday, not because they serve on the planning board, you don't abdicate your right to be a person because you operate on a board, right? So if I'm buying my friend a birthday present that happens to serve on a board, within reason, it should be clear and understood that we're not doing this because of your board member relationship. Now, if you were to buy this coffee or this gift or whatever it is, say it's over $50 for that person, and then the next week you go into the planning board and say, hey, I have a request, and friend, what do you think? That's going to put them in a really awkward position. But it's not something that should be so restrictive that you can't continue with your personal relationships. Just like if you go to Capital Sports and they have a veterans discount, you absolutely, if you served our country, should be eligible to use that veterans discount, but you're getting it because you're a veteran, not because you serve on the water and sewer district. Okay. Good? Okay. What about if you are on the city road crew, can you use the city shop on Saturday afternoon to change the oil in your pickup? No. And I had this argument with a city road superintendent in a city in January. He's like, in our shop, it says, as long as the mayor okays it, it's okay. That is not true. You can't do that. It says that in here. You cannot use, let's see if we can find it. Next page. Yeah. So L12. Public officer and employee may not use public time, facilities, equipment, supplies, personnel, or funds for the officers or employees' private business purposes. So you can't use that. And also they had to add that you can't use it and you can't give your friends permission to use it either. So you can't say, well, I'm not going to do it, but go ahead. Because you're opening the city or the county up to unnecessary risk. If your friend's in there changing their oil and the lift falls and they get smashed underneath, who's responsible for that? Who's going to cover that for the insurance? Those are the kinds of questions that come up when you have those kinds of situations. Our public officer or employee may not use public time, facilities, equipment, supplies, personnel, or funds to solicit support for or opposition to any political committee, the nomination or election of any person to public office, or the passage of a ballot issue, unless very specific things apply. So you can't run for clerk and recorder and or run for re-election as clerk and recorder and print your flyers off on the county copy machine. It also says public time, which is really interesting because elected officials often don't have established office hours. So when are they on public time and when are they on private time? When are they allowed to campaign? Those are all potentially sticky questions. And again, it doesn't mean that, so you're not allowed to use public assets to do that or public time. That doesn't mean that you lose your voice as an individual private citizen. So if you want to go advocate for something at the legislature, you can do that, or at City Hall, or at the county commission, wherever it may be, or city county, I guess here. You just have to be very clear about who you're representing. So let's say I want to go advocate on behalf of something, but I happen to serve on the fire district, but I'm going to go advocate about, I don't know, this water or this street maintenance program that I think is a good idea. I can go do that, but when I get up there to talk, I say, my name is Ashley Kent, and I'm here representing myself as a private citizen. Make it very clear that I'm not here as a representative of the board. So you don't lose your right to participate in civics. You just have to be clear about what role you're in when you do that. How are we doing online? Okay. Oh, it's break time. That's true. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back, finish up ethics. We'll talk a little bit about nepotism, your course and scope and why it's really important to know that. And then we'll cover some of our resources in the other side of the packet. Ooh, lots of food. Okay, let's go get a snack. All right, so how do we feel about the ethics stuff? Does it seem clear-ish? Don't use your information that you get through your service to enrich your own personal financial situation. Don't accept major gifts. Ooh, let me tell you the story. So we were doing ethics training one time, and one of the city clerks was sitting in the front couple of rows. She got real white and kind of blood drained from her face. We're like, hey, what's going on? She's like, oh, we messed up. Okay, what's happening? She goes, well, our city contracted with an engineering firm to do an infrastructure project, and the project came in ahead of schedule and under budget. How often does that happen in municipal government? Like, that might be the only time ever, potentially, right? They were super excited about it. Everybody's engineering firm's excited, the city's excited, everybody's good. A couple months later, so a couple representatives from the engineering firm came into the office, city office, with these big brown boxes. And they opened them up, and they had given each of the public works crew full Carhartt bibs. And they had their name embroidered on it, and then the city. And they gave each of the office staff the like waist length Carhartt jackets, same thing, name and city embroidered on it. Is that inappropriate? So as we're talking about this and going through details, their initial reaction was no, because the project is over, so we're not discharging duties in a biased manner. So we should be good, right? She said, but here's the issue. What happens when we do our next infrastructure project? That's the problem. So the combined fact that it's over $50 and it could potentially look like you're favoring one company over the other. Even if the project that you worked on them with is over, the future projects, there may not be a public expectation that it's a fair shake. So just that in and of itself, probably not a great idea. She goes, oh, it gets worse. Okay. Said, we have our name and the city embroidered on the front, and on the back, it says XYZ Engineering. Definitely outside of appropriate range now, right? Because if you do a project, say next year, and a competing firm comes in to drop off their proposal, and they see the city clerk wearing a jacket with a certain engineering firm embroidered on the back, they're probably not going to expect that they're going to get a fair review. So just because the project's over doesn't necessarily mean that that responsibility goes away. I thought that was a really good example. Yeah. Yeah. Ooh. So if it's like a coffee cup. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so that's a great point. So there's two pieces of this, right? There's the substantial value and then there's the improper influence. So let's say they gave you not a Yeti mug because they're expensive, but an off-brand, and it's customized with your name and the city and the engineering plan and maybe 2022 on it, right? It's under the value. If it's sitting on the desk, does it look like there's a favorite preferred vendor? Potentially. Those are the things where I would ask your legal counsel if they're comfortable with it, because they would have to defend you. This happened to me, and I knew the answer, but I just had to give Dan a hard time about it anyway. One of the hotels in town that I do a lot of training in their conference space, some of it for the center and some of it for consulting work that I do on my own. Actually, most of the work I do at this place is on my own, but they know that I work at MSU. They know they can find me there. So they came in at Christmas and gave me a gift package. And in that package, it had an Ellsbelt's cookie, which is a local baker in town, and they have amazing cookies, and a little packet of tea, and this itty bitty baby succulent. Now I know that all of these things are not $50. But I go running into Dan's office. I was like, please let me keep it. It's just a cute little succulent. And he's like, well, is it over $50? I was like, no. He's like, is it going to improperly influence your decisions? I was like, no. Like, then you can keep it. But those are decisions that you have to have every time something like this comes up. And a lot of times what will happen is the situation, you won't realize it's an ethics question until after it's over, like the case with the engineering firm. We had another crew that was going to the league conference. It was in West Yellowstone. And one of the people that was a public official in the car asked if they could stop by this vendor in West and pick up an espresso machine for their coffee shop that they own personally with their husband. We're going there anyway, it doesn't matter. Well, it's not adding extra expense to the county asset necessarily, but if we go back to an economic benefit tantamount to a gift, you now are not paying shipping on that asset, and your competitor would have to. So you're getting a benefit based on your position with the county, the city, I guess in this case, that your competitors don't have access to. If you were to get rear-ended on the way home with that thing in the back and they're super heavy and it injures somebody in the car, who's responsible for that? It's a city vehicle, but it's your personal property. So there's lots of questions that come out and things like that. So it's just a matter of recognizing one, when you're in an ethical situation, I think is the hardest, and then working through those questions to determine whether you're in bounds or not. Good online? Okay. So let's talk really quick. We're going to talk about nepotism, and then I want to make sure when we get to course and scope, remind me about advisory versus administrative boards. I want to make sure we don't forget that. But first, on L17, the blue corner page, this is where we talk about nepotism as it's defined in our state code. What is nepotism? Yeah. Yes. So you're giving somebody, hiring somebody based on your relationship to them, not on their qualifications. So in Montana, there are two types of, or subtypes of nepotism. See it in 22302 in that last sentence in that block. It's either by consanguinity within the 4th degree or affinity within the 2nd degree. Consanguinity is just a fun word to say. What it really means is that you're related by blood. It's a fancy way to say blood relation. And affinity means you're related by marriage. So this happens every year in the small towns when they have their pools open and they need to hire lifeguards and all the teenagers turn in their applications, and half of them are related to the mayor. How do we deal with that? Well, in that situation, typically what they'll do is send the applications to a neighboring town, have them review them, pick somebody, and then they set up a reporting structure so the mayor isn't supervising her niece. So there's ways around it because we live in small town Montana and sometimes that just happens. But if we think about consanguinity versus affinity, if I'm hiring someone and I look at my sister, she's 1 degree by consanguinity, by blood. Her daughter would be 2 degrees from me, so I can't hire her because she's within the 4 degrees of consanguinity. If I look at my husband's side, so as soon as I go to my husband, I'm in affinity. So he's my 1st degree of affinity. His sister is the 2nd degree of affinity. I'm outside the 2 degrees of affinity as defined in our code, I'm good. So I can't hire my niece, but I can hire my nephew. I wouldn't because he's 7 and he lives in Jacksonville, Florida, but I could, right? So just thinking about how you're related to the person and where it fits. If you get into that situation, talk to either your county or city attorney or call us and we'll try to help you out. Hopefully boards are not in that position very often. You're more likely to run into conflict of interest. You're on a board a lot of times because you have industry experience. You're on a water sewer board because you were a pipe fitter for years or something like that, right? You can't be a part of a decision if your personal private business could benefit from it. So if I own, let's say, a contracting company, a construction company, and the fire district whose board I sit on needs to expand their fire hall, I can stay on the board, but if my company wants to bid on that project, I need to recuse myself from both the vote and the discussion. I need to not be in the room when that happens because it would be a conflict of interest for me to vote or to weigh in on that in any way because my personal business would benefit from that contract. Make sense? So when we talk about conflict of interest, as the code defines it, it's about the financial interest. That's the biggie conflict of interest. Little e is there a perceived conflict that would improperly influence your decision making? And so the biggie conflict of interest, you should disclose ahead of time and then let everybody know if you need to recuse yourself from action, this is why. Okay. Good. Okay. Let's look at L19, general board statutes. So the reason I call this out is we talk about the resolution creating an administrative board district commission must specify these things. The most important thing, in my opinion, non-legal opinion, is your purpose. Why does your board exist? What is your role or your course and scope? And are you administrative or advisory? So each board is created for a specific narrow purpose. You don't have wide range like a commission or a council would. You oversee one specific area, and usually it's advisory, unless you have semi-autonomous status, administrative status, which means you would have your own budget. Often your people are elected, independent from the commission, and you have your own insurance. So fire districts fall under that quite often. If you don't fall into that, if you're an advisory board, the only thing you can do is make recommendations back to your governing body. We had in a small town, we had a advisory board member of a municipal tree board. And he was out doing his advisory board duty. He was walking around the community, kind of checking out the trees. And there was this one tree, it was like 80 years old, that hung over the city property and over the sidewalk and was directly over the sidewalk several feet. It was starting to lose its integrity, starting to break down. He's like, this is dangerous. This isn't okay. We have to do something about this. So he goes back to the advisory board, the tree board. Hey guys, we got to look at this. They make a recommendation to the council. Council says, yep, we'll deal with this. So they start working with the property owner. Property owner says, no, it's fine. There's no structural integrity issues and it's pretty and it provides shade and I don't want to lose it. It's 80 years old. So there's this kind of stalemate with between the property owner and the city. The advisory board member is getting more and more frustrated. This is dangerous. We need to do something. So one afternoon, he just takes his chainsaw out and cuts the tree off at the property line. Ugh, don't do that. Okay. Because he was advisory only, he is acting outside of his course and scope. He was personally liable for the damages and all of the attorney fees when he lost that court case, and the city could not defend him. Their insurance didn't cover him. So he got to pay for all of that out of his own pocket. It's like $15,000. We have several examples of that happening around the state, not because people are trying to do things inappropriately, they just don't understand their board's role, purpose, and what they can and can't do. How much power do you have as an individual? Administrative advisory doesn't matter. You don't. The board has power as a body. Board members individually can't take action on their own. So you can only take action when you're in a quorum, in a public meeting, properly noticed, all of the things. That's when you have authority to take action, even if that action is just to make recommendations. On your own, you can't take any actions like cutting down trees. If you have not seen the resolution that creates your board, I highly suggest you look it up. It should be on record with the respective governing bodies, so city or county. Almost all boards are created by resolution of the governing body. If your board was created a really long time ago before electronic records, there is a possibility that there is not a record of the resolution. It just doesn't exist anymore. If that's the case, I would ask your governing body to create a new resolution affirming the board's scope, purpose, and role, and all the other things that are in that general statutes. And just because they create a new one doesn't mean that you are delegitimizing everything that the board's done to that point. You just say, we don't have record of it. Here's the new resolution to reaffirm. It doesn't invalidate all the work the board's done to this point. That's protecting you as an individual and as a board under the jurisdiction and insurance protection of the county or the city. Like I said, in some situations, they have their own insurance, they have their own budgets, but that's more the exception than the rule, I would say. So just be aware of that and check it out. And then once your board or committee meeting is done on L20, you'll see at the bottom board minutes. They need to be filed, posted, and available for public inspection within 30 days of approval of the minutes. That kind of freaks people out sometimes because they'll say, well, we only meet every other month. Are we always out of compliance? No, because if we have a meeting tonight and we meet again in 2 months, what is it, February? So if we meet again in April, we'll approve the meeting minutes from tonight. And then you have 30 days from that April meeting to get tonight's minutes posted. So it's not 30 days from the day it happens, it's 30 days from the date that they're approved. Now, a lot of boards will provide draft minutes in their next board packet that's available to the public, and that's completely fine. But those final approved minutes by statute must be available within 30 days of approval. Good? Okay. All right, that is all of the left side packet. This is a ton of information. We go through it pretty quick, but we highlighted a lot of the important parts so you can go back and check them out. I want to make sure we look at the right side packet because it's more kind of reference material, but I just want to let you know what's in here. So we have the principles of good governance on R1. This, in addition to the statutes, is kind of the guiding principles that we use to determine whether people are following good public policy and public process. Things like legitimacy and voice, direction, performance, accountability, and fairness. They're pretty standard and expected values, but it's helpful to see a definition. And the one thing that I'll call out in here that may not have been a consideration, at least in depth for some boards, is direction. Do you have a strategic vision? For some places, that may be a 60-page strategic plan, say the county commission. For let's say a cemetery board, it may just be that we're providing compassionate, adequate service and keeping the facilities in nice, respectful working order for the next generation to come in and enjoy and be able to use. That might be all the common vision you need as a board. But if you don't have a common, clear vision that you've discussed, how do you determine the criteria by which you make decisions? Meaning, if we have a proposal come in front of us today, and we say yes to it, just because it's here and we can, and then next month we have another proposal come in and we say no because we just spent our money on this proposal, how do we find consistency with that long-term vision? If we have a unified vision and that proposal that came in today doesn't fit it, we can say, no, we're not going to do that, not because we don't have the money or we can't, but it doesn't fit with our agreed upon vision, whereas the next one might. So it's just helpful to clarify so everybody's working towards the same goal. Okay. R3, the orange piece here, is our boilerplate rules of procedure. If you don't have bylaws or rules of procedure, this is a great template to start with. It's built for a water sewer district, but it can really be adapted to just about anything. It gives you some good ideas of things that should be included, like the format of your agenda, rules for board member participation, rules for public participation. I was dealing with a board last week who has a member who's kind of trying to go rogue and firing up the community, and they're trying to create protests about this board action and all this stuff, which is fine. I mean, they're allowed to do protests, that's cool. But the rest of the board members feel like this one member is not acting in good faith to cooperate with the rest of the board, even if they disagree. They're not doing their duty as a board member in good faith. Said, well, do you have procedures or a policy established about what you expect as behavior as a board member? I said, no. We can't hold them accountable to something that doesn't exist. Just because I think it's inappropriate, if you think it's appropriate, then who are we to say that it's not? So having all of those things written down will always benefit you because you have something to fall back on. Those are in here as well. The one thing that's not in here is any reference to limiting public comment, like to 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever. So if you wanted to add that, you would have to add it in here somewhere. And then the last section that we have is about parliamentary procedure. And that's the brown and gold corners at the end. So we focus on Robert's Rules of Order as our parliamentary procedure framework. Most boards in the state, I would say, use this to some degree. If you follow the very formal version of this, it's a lot. It's very strict, it's very structured, rigid. You have to be recognized, you have to stand up, you have to propose a motion, chair has to repeat the motion, then it needs to be seconded, repeat again, it goes to the floor, and then you can discuss. It's a very long process. Most boards in the state don't follow that, which is fine because it provides for procedures in small boards. So one of the kind of sections in here. It allows you to do things that are less formal, such as raising your hand instead of standing when seeking to obtain the floor. There's no limit to the number of times a board member can speak on a debatable question. Lots of things, but one that's really important. Informal discussion of a subject is permitted while no motion is pending. So we had this question earlier today in the afternoon session. They said, how is it, where is that? How is it that you can recommend this structure when we don't have a motion pending? We didn't put the motion on the floor here before we had the expert presentation. How are you doing that and following Robert's rules? That's a great question. Under the small board rules, you can do that because this informal discussion is all happening before the motion hits the floor. Okay, so just be aware that that flexibility is available inside of Robert's rules if that's the one you use. Make sure part of your bylaws or rules of procedure define which parliamentary procedure system you use, because it gives people a chance to know the rules of engagement if they want to come interact with the board. General rule, be as formal as you need to be and no more formal than that, because parliamentary procedure should not be a weapon used to get your way, even if it's not the will of the majority. It should be a tool to help people engage. And if it's too cumbersome or too intimidating, you're not adhering to that constitutional responsibility to encourage participation. Okay. If you want to know more about Parley Pro for public officials in Montana, I did an online course based on the book, and it is free and on our website, self-paced. You can take it anytime. It is 6 units, and I think it takes about 2 hours to go through it. We talk about main motion, amendment to the main, amendment to the amendment, call the question, and divide the question, I think are the 5 motions that we go through. So if you call the question, if you're having debate amongst the board and somebody moves to call the question, you're moving to stop debate where it's at and go directly to the vote, no more discussion. That has to be done by a 2/3 vote instead of a majority vote, because you are limiting people's right to talk. So if you're limiting people's rights, in this case, the board members, you have to do that by a higher threshold of 2/3. And then divide the question. If you have a question that has multiple parts and you want to say yes to one piece of it and no to the other piece, you can divide it so that at least part of it gets passed without denying the entire thing. So that's another useful tool. I think those motions are probably 75% of what you would need in a typical public meeting. Usually it's about the main motion, seconding the main, and then the vote for that. So just being clear about your vote. The only time that you should be abstaining from a vote is if you have a conflict of interest. You have been put in this position either by appointment or election to represent the people. So your duty is to represent the people, not to not vote because it's a contentious situation and you don't want to pick a side. It's not really how that works. You should, best practice, be giving reasons for your vote. So when you get to the time to vote, explain your kind of thought process to the citizens before you say yes or no. So pumper truck. Seems like a lot of money to spend on a truck that's, what, 10 years old, 12, 14 years old at this point? That seems like a pretty substantial investment, but I recognize that our risk factor keeps going up and it's costing our members more in their insurance premiums, and we want to make sure we're providing adequate coverage. So this seems like the best deal that we're going to find, and it's going to help maintain that service for members. So while it seems like a lot of money and I'm not 100% convinced that it's the best use of our resources, I think it meets our needs right now, so I'm going to vote yes. So you're giving them a little bit of insight into what you're thinking and how you're thinking about it, especially if you're incorporating things that you heard them say in public comment. So you're getting some feedback to them about, I'm not just ignoring you when you're up here talking, I'm actively listening and engaged to what you're saying. Inside that online course, there's also some printable handouts. So in addition to this, there's some things in there you could print and kind of use as cheat sheets if you needed to during your session or during your meetings. Okay, I think that's all of our material. Is there any, are there any questions online or any questions in the room about anything that we've covered tonight? It was a lot, I know. Yeah. How do we balance discussion between members of the board and open to the public? I would recommend going back to that structure, even if you don't have an expert presentation, have the board discuss first, then have public comment, and then close public comment and go back into board discussion. So it introduces, gives them a chance to interact, and then the board gets to deliberate before they decide. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a good question. Anybody online? Good, okay. Yeah. Ooh, are there any rules to facilitate online discussion in the event that it got heated? We saw this in Gallatin County last year, or was it 2 years ago? I don't know. Whenever the pandemic started, we went into our first shutdown. They were going to hold the conversation about, I don't remember if it was masks or about shutting down, whichever one it was. They were going to hold it at the Commons on Love Lane in Gallatin County. And people wouldn't quiet down, wouldn't settle down to be able to start the meeting. So they postponed the meeting for 3 days, and then they went on virtual. And do you think that made people more or less angry? They were irate, right? So public officials are trying to figure it out. They're trying to work through it, figure out what are we doing? We don't know. This is a brand new situation. We've never done a meeting online like this before. They kept to their same policy of 3 minutes per person, and they would just let people just scream at them for 3 minutes. People were crying, people were cussing, they were doing all their things. They would go back to, here's our expectations for public engagement, and they're in your policies. So if you're not following that, we're going to mute you because that's not appropriate. But I would be very cautious to limit somebody's ability to access it. So in that case, the person that had the Zoom host was the only one that could mute and unmute. and they would unmute, let the person talk. They would give them like 5 warnings. Like, you have to have respectful language. You need to stay calm. You need to do all these things based on our agreed upon rules of engagement. And I would say 99% of the time, they still let them rant. And they would say, your 3 minutes are up. And they would give them like another 15 seconds to wrap up, and then they would mute them. So I would say that's a fairly drastic kind of cutoff, and I would not use that unless absolutely necessary. As far as the online meetings go, I think it's great that people can engage online. If you're going to advertise a meeting via Zoom, make sure that you also include the phone number that comes with it. Because if something were to happen and Zoom goes down, they could still call it. Because let's say they called in via Zoom on this meeting tonight, and they're in Augusta with the expectation that they get to hear it all on Zoom, but then Zoom goes down. Now they can't get here. There's no way to get here before it's done. So they don't get to participate in this open meeting because their expectations weren't met that they were promised. If you have the phone option too, even if Zoom goes down, we can all call into the phone option and they can at least hear and discuss. Video is great. Audio is, in my opinion, more important because that live interaction, the ability to simultaneously hear and respond is what makes it live discussion. Does that answer the question? Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. So if somebody's creating a lot of background noise and it's disrupting the meeting and they're not even at their computer anymore and you just hear background noise, I would say it's appropriate to mute. If they want to give public comment, you absolutely, if you raise your hand or if you do, however you do it, get them in line, they're welcome to unmute again. But I don't think it's inappropriate in that case, just for the decorum and continuance of the meeting. If you're using mute as a way to silence people, do that with extreme caution. That should be at the very last resort. We want to give people as much leniency as we possibly can. But just as far as regular Zoom etiquette, we all know we never mute when we're supposed to, or we never unmute when we're supposed to. It's just part of being on Zoom. Good? Yeah. Okay. So can both of them? Or, yeah, okay. Okay, so can an elected board set rules for removal and can an appointed board? I would typically say, if I remember this right, we have to look in the general board statutes. I think the way that it goes is the people that put you on the board are the only ones that can remove you from the board. So you don't get to vote somebody else off the island. If the commissioners appointed you to the board, the commissioners are the ones that could remove you from the board. But you can't remove each other from the board. If you get elected to a position, the recourse for removing somebody from that position is a recall. So unless there's a specific circumstance where that's not the case, the general rule is the person that put you there or people that put you there are the ones that can remove you. And that's part of what's going on with this board member I was talking about that doesn't seem to be acting in good faith. The county commission doesn't want to get in the middle of the firestorm, so they're just refusing to do anything. So the rest of the board members are frustrated because they're saying it's the commission's job to hold this person accountable, and they're not. Well, yes and no. It's the commission's job to remove somebody if they're not fulfilling their duties. But right now, fulfilling your duties is a very subjective thing because we don't have any expectations for behavior. They don't have anything in their bylaws. Okay. Anything else? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So did we talk about quasi-judicial and a little bit? Okay. So ex parte communication comes in. It's especially important when you're talking about zoning, variances, Adhering to policy. So when you're creating policy, that's legislative. When you're determining whether policy is being met or not, that tends to get more into that quasi-judicial role. If you are in an actual quasi-judicial body, you shouldn't be talking to anyone outside of those open meetings. That includes other board members or interested parties. That's all ex parte because it needs to happen in the quote unquote courtroom. If you're in a legislative role, if you're saying we're on the planning board and we're looking at a new subdivision or we're looking at a new street and we're just trying to gather input from people, we haven't developed a policy yet. We're trying to figure out what it should look like. Then it's appropriate for you as a board member to be out interacting with the public, trying to understand what they think. This goes back then to that quorum thing. If you have 6 people on the board and you're trying to understand where the board's at, you could potentially talk to up to 2 other board members and not meet the quorum requirement. So 3 of the 6 is not quorum. If one of the 3 of you then talks to another board member, now you have a quorum violation because the 4 out of the 6 have had this discussion in some way. Does that make sense? Okay. And like I said, if you do accidentally get into a place where you think you've created an ex parte situation, disclose it at the next public meeting because you want to be as transparent, as predictable, and as routine as possible to the point where you're boring because that's how you get people to trust you. You're not doing anything shady behind closed doors. Did we talk about when you post your meeting notices? I don't know if we did. We talked a little bit about how, whether you should be posting in the newspaper or the 3 places, depending on what your requirements are from your jurisdiction. You should also be posting at the same time in the same places, whatever those places are, each week or month or after you meet. So like for the Gallatin County Commission, I know among other places they posted on their website and they meet Tuesday mornings, I think the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of the month, and they will have their entire board packet posted online by Thursday at noon. I know that because it's listed on their website and in the rules of procedure. So if I need to go deal with the commission on something, I know when to look for the information and where to look. And if it's not there, that seems suspicious to me. So just having that routine and communicating, and you'll sound like you're just blue in the face talking the same things over and over. Be as consistent as you possibly can, because that's how you build trust with your community. Was that the question? What was the question? Oh, we were talking about ex parte. Okay. Does that make sense? We good? Okay. What else? Yeah. All of them. So what if the bylaws state that after 3 consecutive meetings missed, then basically you're not fulfilling your duties? This is, if I remember right, a little bit different for the county and the cities, and that the counties, I think it's a little bit more defined. Or maybe it's the other way around. I don't remember. We'll have to look. But I would say your bylaws are a good place to start. But if you don't have the authority to enact that power, then it doesn't matter if it's in your bylaws or not. So if you're unsure, talk to either the body that created you or probably more likely the city or county attorney and find out if you have the authority to have that in your bylaws. If you do, great, then you have a procedure built out and you have a way to remove that person if they're not fulfilling their duties. And some of it may be statutorily defined or it may not. But if you don't, even if it's in there, you still don't get permission to break the law if it's not something you have authority to do to start with. Good? Anything else? Yeah. No, you're good. Do you need to disclose your conflict of interest? You should. Especially, I know on the county side, there's a form that most counties have that when you get elected or appointed, you fill out the form. These are my financial interests, significant interests. So if I own a business or co-own or whatever, things like that. And I don't know, Danae, does the city have a financial or a conflict of interest form? Okay. So the city currently doesn't, but I also know the city is working really hard to come up with some best practices that are consistent across city boards. So everybody kind of has the same guidance. I would imagine that might be part of what's going into that. Okay. So if you don't have it, it may be worth just having it on record saying, hey, these are the businesses I own, and you just give that to whoever keeps your records. And then if something comes up, you can say, I have a conflict of interest. It's disclosed previously. And because of this conflict of interest, and I would tell them what it is, I own this business, or I'm a partial owner in this business, whatever it is, I'm going to recuse myself from this action that's on the agenda, which means you get up and you leave the room for both the discussion and the vote. Good? Yeah. What constitutes an expert? In what context? Ooh. Yeah. Okay. Why did I not keep track of that thing? So what constitutes an expert? I would say anyone who is introducing and has substantial knowledge of the topic. Typically, it's going to be somebody on staff. So it could be the fire chief, it could be the city planner, it could potentially be an applicant, possibly, depending on what the proposed action is. So like a developer might come in and give a presentation on a proposed development, and they may be the expert to that topic. The board would then ask them questions, but the public doesn't get to berate the developer with a bunch of questions and nasty comments directly. The opposing viewpoint? Yeah. So could a resident who maybe is not involved with the city or the county be considered an expert because they have a lot of knowledge experience in that area? And they may be on the opposing side, so you want to give fair weight to both. I don't see, there's nothing, unless you have your bylaws written in a way which would prohibit it, there's no reason that you couldn't. I would make it really clear about what's going on. And just make sure that you have a compelling case why you're giving a single resident special status beyond public comment to balance. Now, what you could do, you could have public comment where you have all pros go first and then all support go first, all opposed go second, or you could have alternate, one person that supports, then one that opposes, and back and forth until there's none left. Another thing that we've seen happen, in fact, I was part of the crew that did it in Belgrade, our subdivision that we live in, brand new. Once we all bought our brand new homes on our 1.5 acres in these beautiful lots, after probably the first 2 or 3 phases were put in, the developer came back to the city county planning board and proposed phase 4 or 5, I don't know which one it was, which included a 104 unit apartment complex. How do you think that went over with all of us who just bought our single family homes on our 1/2 acre lots? Not super great, right? So you now have a public meeting where you've got, well, at the time, I think there was a little over 100 lots that had houses built on them. So potentially up to 200 people trying to cram into the Belgrade city chambers, all fired up about this issue. The expert in this case was the developer, and he got up and did his proposal. When we got to this point, they said, we know you're all here in opposition. You all have a right to speak, and that's fine. But what we proposed was, if we all give up our 3 minutes, will you give one person from our position 20 minutes to give a coherent, longer presentation? And they said yes, as long as everybody else in the room that has that position agrees to that. It's your right, not ours, that's being violated. So they had us all raise our hand, are you all good with this? And we did it. And then we gave 20 minutes to one person versus like 480 minutes total time to 200 people or whatever it was. And that worked really well, but that was a suspension of the rules. It took a 2/3 vote to override their bylaws temporarily so that we could do that. So there are some ways around it. So I would prefer to see something like that happen, because then that person's staying in public comment status, even though they're getting a little bit of different opportunity. Yes, the expert should be named on the agenda, and it may be by name or it may be by position. So it may be fire chief presentation, or it may be developer. So it doesn't have to say developer's personal name, but it may say developer business name because that's their legal entity, right? And that owner of that development company is the representative of the company, but it's the company that's there in a legal sense, trying to ask for whatever their proposal is. Yeah. So if you're in public comment, can you go back up to Q&A for the board? What I would do is finish out public comment, close it down, and then go back to board discussion and allow them more Q&A with the expert. I would do it that way versus jumping back up. Online? Yeah. That is a great question. So it's talking about subcommittees. And this is, yes, you heard correctly. This has been a topic that we've talked about a lot in recent board trainings. If a board creates a subcommittee, let's say it's a 6-person board and they create a subcommittee with 2 of those board members on the subcommittee and 3 members of the public, that subcommittee now has its own open meeting requirements. So you are not able to kind of circumvent those requirements just because only 2 of the 6 original board members are on there. Now, every time that 3 of those 5 new subcommittee members meet and hear, discuss, or act, you are in open meeting requirement territory, which I know is not efficient, but again, it goes back to protecting the constitutional rights. So what we've seen over the last probably 6 or 7 years is a lot of places moving away from the subcommittee structure, because every time you create a subcommittee, you have new agendas, new notice, new minutes, you have new everything that all have to be followed. And you don't get to get around that by appointing fewer than quorum board members to that subcommittee, because it's now its own independent body as a subcommittee. What we've seen groups do is move to the work session business meeting model. So the body will meet, say, the first Monday of the month for their work session. No decisions will be made. They'll post an agenda about what they're going to work on, and that'll be that open discussion back and forth time, and they'll really dig into the material. And then on the 3rd Monday of the month, they'll have their business meeting. And that's where you have your regular agenda with actions, proposed actions to consider, and all of the standard agenda items. Even during the work sessions, they need to be noticed, need to have an agenda, and there needs to be time for public comment, just like you would on everything else. As any time a public body is meeting, the citizens have a constitutional right to observe and to participate. Not the answer that I know we want to hear, but that's what's consistent with the law. Okay. Anything else? Yeah. Do it with the city or the county? Which one? City. Who should they talk to about a potential conflict of interest? Are you mic'd up? So Danae said, if you are, so with the city, if you have a question about a potential conflict of interest or any of these legal counsel type questions, talk to your staff liaison. They can talk to either the clerk's office and then they can relay it to the city attorney, or however we need to follow the process, appropriate process. We go back to that whole legislative versus executive role, making sure we're following the right path so people are not being asked to go outside of their course and scope as an employee to support the board. making sure that you get an answer. And if you don't, we'll go back and talk to the clerk and make sure that we get you what you need eventually. But by all means, always ask all the questions up front, because there's no stupid question. There's no potential conflict that is too small. If you need to feel comfortable, absolutely ask the question. On the county side, if you don't have a staff liaison, because I don't know if they do or not, start with the commission's office, if your board needs help, or the clerk and recorder, and they can work through the process to get you to that legal counsel. Good? Anything else? Ooh, we like hypotheticals. This would never happen, but possibly in theory, we could talk about it.
Considering the Democratic
Mm-hmm. 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 It's a good question. So the question is, what are the legal or ethical requirements of a board to consider the overwhelming public opinion that they hear through public comment? Fair. Those board members are appointed or elected to represent the public. They have no legal mandate to vote one way or the other. So the only way that the public is guaranteed that their voice is heard vote for vote with what they want is a ballot initiative, something that goes directly to the vote of the electorate. Now, should they be voting in opposition to what they overwhelmingly hear, we're all opposed to this, and they still vote for it, there may be some question about whether or not you are discharging your duties appropriately, but there's no legal requirement for them to vote one way or the other. The recourse is for them to be either removed from their position by the board body that appointed them, if they feel that's appropriate, which is a high bar, or recall the election or vote them out at the next election. So we saw that a lot with the health board situation during COVID, right? Gallatin County was a perfect example. We had tons and tons of people speaking in opposition to the closures, and the health board still found, by their finding of fact, that it was the appropriate thing to do, so they did. I would be willing to bet, at least at the county, maybe not in the city population, but the county population, more than half of them disagreed with that. But that didn't mean that there was a case for them to be removed because of their vote. Does that make sense? Okay, tell me more. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for those board members who are not elected, they're appointed to their boards. Typically, you'll find in the resolution that created them that if they are not fulfilling their duties, they can be removed from their office or their position. And the body that created them, the commission or the council typically, could replace them if they're not meeting the duties of the office. That is nebulous, and I would imagine most city and county legal counsel, unless it's egregious, would not encourage their governing bodies to do that, because it's putting them in a really tough position to defend. So really, when it comes down to it, the accountability to the people is electing the elected positions, electing in or out the people that you agree with, or think that are serving the interest of the public. And in this case, let's say it's the commission that appointed the board. and the board is making decisions that you disagree with, your recourse would be to elect new commissioners, not necessarily board members. Does that track? Okay. It's a process. When trying to have instant accountability is a really difficult thing if you strongly disagree with the decision that somebody made. Because it's kind of a high bar to get somebody out of a role. Yeah. A review of board and board member liability. Okay, so that goes back to the course and scope and why I spend so much emphasis on understand your purpose, understand your role or your advisory or administrative, and understand what you can do under your kind of legal mandate. Because if you are acting within course and scope, let's say health board, because we all saw those go down, and they vote one way or the other, and a group of citizens sues based on that vote. If they're acting within course and scope, even if there's a lawsuit, they're protected by the county's insurance to defend them in court. If they're acting outside of course and scope, like the tree board member that's cutting things down, the county cannot defend them. Even if they want to, they can't, because they're outside of their defined lane. So liability really comes down to understanding what your purpose is as a board member and what you're allowed to do as a body. If you're advisory, it is only to make recommendations back to the governing body. And that sounds minor. It's a big deal to have advisory boards because they dig into the issues in depth that the governing bodies couldn't do on their own. So while advisory sounds limiting, it's a vital step in this local government process to engage directly with the citizens and spend the time to really understand the subject at hand and then make the recommendation back. Now, the governing body doesn't have to take the recommendation, but they usually have to have a pretty compelling reason why they don't. Yeah. That is a really tough situation to be in. So if you have inactive members that the governing body refuses to replace, what do you do? The short answer is if you can't get a quorum, you can't do anything. And that's incredibly frustrating. But that's where you would then go back and champion to your governing body why it's important that the board exists, the work that you're not able to get done, and what you need to remedy to get there. So you're saying of our 6 board members, 4 of them refuse to show up. They will not do anything. And because of that choice to be inactive and not fulfill their duties, we can't fulfill any of the requirements that we have. So we're not serving the public. We're not doing any good for the people of the community. We need the board, the governing body, to remedy this by replacing offices or whatever it may be based on the resolution. I know, again, this is a very frustrating answer. Okay, what else? That's it. All right. Well, if you have any questions, our information is on the back of the packet. It's also on a lot of the handouts, MSU Local Government Center. It's msulocalgov.org. We are happy to answer questions. We're here to support local government. So if Danae or Betsy don't know the answer, they are always welcome to call us. We may or may not know the answer as well, but we'll try our best to support everything that we can. And this whole system of local government only works because volunteers like you step up to serve in these roles. So thank you for doing that. This is the reason that we have successful communities. Appreciate your time. I know this is probably not the top priority of things you want to be doing on a Thursday night for 3 hours, but I really appreciate your dedication. So thanks so much. I'll hang out for a little bit if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, drive safe. Thank you.